Welcome to the space where creators have aligned a positive and intellectual collab of open minds. For sharing and learning from one another, it's a vibe. ReadswithRosa podcast on the mic. Subscribe, educators spitting bars. I guess you didn't know I'm multifaceted and humble, checking off life goals. The classroom is my comfort zone where I plant and sow seeds of knowledge, compassion, empathy, and hope. Reading is the key to unlocking your potential. Countless benefits, including cognitive and mental. Regardless of the genre, books are highly influential. Go get yours, I'll get mine. Making strides, monumental. And rock with me and get down to this new jam. With my friends, I had a very simple plan. Educate the masses through books and life lessons. It's the grand slam. I'm out.
𝚠𝚒𝚕𝚎, kia ora, and welcome to the Reads with Rosa podcast. I'm really excited to introduce today's guest. She is an award-winning poet, a Māori scholar, and an irredentist. She is a mother who wears many hats, but during the day, she is a professor. She researches and teaches Māori, Pacific, and indigenous texts in order to center indigenous expansiveness and decenter colonialism. It is my honor to welcome to the show Dr. Alice Te Punga Somerville.
Oh, kia ora. It's my honor to be here.
I'm like, get a grip, man. Get a grip. Thank you for being here. It's an honor. I'm excited, as you can tell. As you could tell when you came onto the screen before. Oh my goodness, Alice, how are you? How are things in your part of the world?
Yeah, good. Yep. I'm really good. So I'm living here in Canada. I live in Vancouver, which is Musqueam, unceded / stolen Musqueam whenua. I'm just checking. It's 9 p.m. here. So it's Friday night. It's getting a bit summery over here. So we just went and had fish and chips on the beach. Apologies, Vancouver. The fish and chips are just not like home, but it was still the experience that was cool. Yeah.
I love that so much. Thank you for mentioning fish and chips, because honestly, when I go home, that's always on my to eat bucket list. There's nothing beats fish and chips from home. Like, there's this one place I've been to here, but people say it's like, oh, those are British fish and chips. I'm like, oh no, it just doesn't do it. Gotta go home and have it. So
okay, so apparently there's a new fish and chip shop in Edmonton, which is only about a 12-hour ride from here.
12 hours.
But my husband's Fijian, and it's a Fijian family, I think, that set it up. And so like he heard about it through the Fijian networks. And like when he told me, we just like were both dead serious. It's like, okay, cool, when shall we do it? So we're like, it's so worth it. Yeah.
12 hours. Well, that's commitment right there.
You, Edmonton.
And I can't wait to see updates. You need to post something, a tweet,
putting it
anything.
all over social media for
Put
sure.
it up there. Oh, you'll crack up. Okay, so let's, I guess before we kind of like get into this, I like to give my guests an opportunity. As you mentioned, you do live in Canada right now, but if you could give us a brief intro, tell us a little about you, your iwi.
Yeah, kia ora. Well, he uri tēnei o te Aotearoa me Taranaki. So my iwi affiliations are to the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand, and also we're the lot that moved down to, because of the muskets coming from the north about 200 years ago, some of us migrated down to Wellington. So actually when I'm like homesick for home, it's Wellington. So my marae are in Hutt Valley and Wellington City. My sister, I think it's a long weekend at home this weekend, and so my sister and my mum and one of my cousins are over on Machu Somes Island, one of the little islands in the middle of the harbour. So that's kind of the heart of home for me, is over there.
Many people have said there are parts of Canada that kind of remind them of New Zealand. Like, is that true? What about where you stay? Like, is that true, or have you had an opportunity to explore Canada?
Yeah, so I have. So Vancouver is a lot like New Zealand in that it's it's green. There's lots of water. We're right on the edge of the Pacific here. It's a harbour city, and people are always like, oh, why did you come here? It's so beautiful in New Zealand. And I'm like, well, it's kind of beautiful here too, so it's very lots of trees. So like in the winter time, it might be useful to think about, those cheesy movies, like the Twilight movies.
Yes.
So they were filmed a couple of hours away. So to give you like a sense of like, so if you want to avoid the sunlight, Vancouver's a great place to come for winter. But the summers are beautiful. So about 11 years ago now, I had a sabbatical. So my first academic job was at Victoria University in Wellington, and then at the end of 7 years, I went and had a sabbatical 1 year at the University of Toronto, and so I got to know that part of the country a little bit. And actually, I'd done my PhD just over the border in New York State, and so I know that kind of part of the world a lot better of Aotearoa Island than this part. One of my mates who actually now works over here, he got a job when I was at U of T, University of Toronto, in Aboriginal Studies. He got a job over here to run Indigenous Studies. And so he and I did like this 6-hour road trip from Toronto to Vancouver in a little Prius with his 2 dogs in the back. So I helped him move over. So I actually got to go on this like really trippy road trip just through like all the landscapes, and this is a ridiculously enormous, huge country, and you can kind of like drive for a day and not see anything that's not just plains. Like there's just nothing, there's just horizon, and then there's other bits that are very, the Rockies and mountains and snow and like everything. I mean, it's beautiful, such a beautiful place.
Like prior to going to university and studying and doing all the research and getting your degrees, like, did you ever think that you, a Māori queen, would end up in another part of the world? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm listening to you and I'm like, wow.
No, it's ridiculous. No. And even, even I remember my first year at uni, actually one of my tutors in my first year was 𝚠𝚒𝚕𝚎, the writer, and because he's very well known, he would be like, oh, we don't have a tutorial next week because I'm going to be in Tahiti for a literary festival or whatever. And it totally blew my mind. Like, you can just go to Tahiti for like a week. Like it's something you like work your way up towards for a year, it was just really and also I didn't ever think that I was someone who would want to live away from home, which is ironic because I've now lived about half my adult life away from Aotearoa. But and I remember when I left to do my PhD, I had this like really strong sense of like I'm going to film my kete and then I'm going to go home and I'm going to live there forever. And I actually wrote that in the the dedication or acknowledgements page or something of my PhD thesis, right? I was like, oh, anyway, I'm off home now. I'm gonna spend the rest of my life in Aotearoa. And it turns out Aotearoa's a big place. Stretches over here.
Wow. So let's get. So you were you were lecturing back in Aotearoa. What is that light bulb moment when you're like, you know what, here's an opportunity, I'm going here?
Actually, I think in many ways my being outside Aotearoa so much has been shaped by having done my PhD overseas, and I kind of sometimes I think, oh, that was that decision. I had no idea what I was deciding at the time that I decided it, but it kind of ruined me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm like, damn it, I could have lived at home forever happily if I'd not done that. But I had a really amazing master's thesis supervisor, a kahungunu scholar called Professor Terry Sturm, and he was kind of old school, and he was like a Māori scholar before it was cool to be a Māori scholar, and he was a little bit undercover. No, he wasn't deceitful about his kind of kahungunu, side, but it wasn't like front and center of how he presented and participated in the university. But he was like, he was amazing. He pushed me really hard. I was terrified of him, which made me work really hard. And he told me, he said, you need to go overseas and do a PhD. And I was a little brat. And I was like, oh, no, I've had enough of the white man system. I'm off now. And he was like, oh, yeah, here we go. So about 3 months later, I'm like knocking on his door like, hey, what was that thing about a PhD? And he said, oh, go overseas. And I went, I don't think I want to do that. And then I thought about it, and lots of my mates from uni and some from school, so some of my mates by then were, had kids and, that whole thing. And I knew that I sort of wanted that. But this idea of kind of going overseas appealed, but I also knew that I didn't want to just like get drunk in London every weekend.
Oh, is that what Kiwis do? Oh,
so I was like, that didn't really appeal. So I was like, so I ended up, and I also knew once I decided I wanted to travel with study, I was like, man, I want to get out of the empire. I want to get out of the same conversations about the Queen. And I just want to, go hang out with other Indigenous people. And so that's what took me to the States. And so I was on Kūgā Nation territory there for a while, and spent a year in Hawaii as a part of my PhD process as well. And so when I went home forever. It was the one-way ticket, and Vic is on my tribal territory. So I thought, oh, this is my mana whenua here. I'm going to be forever. But actually, the story of both my departures from New Zealand universities have been basically the story of institutionalized racism, and maybe hitting a point of going, I can't keep going here. And so I left Vic, and I that was the hardest job to leave, because it was the one that felt like, well, I should be here. Like, I'm deserting my post, like this was the thing. And my grandparents were so proud of me to have come back home, and they were really scared I was going to stay away, and, like all that side. And I was like home, and for myself, because I was raised in Auckland, as a Te Aotearoa person, as a Taranaki person, I often talk about kind of moving home after my PhD in Māori, and then by the time I left Wellington, I was Te Aotearoa. Do you know what I mean? Like my kind of iwi identity, which was like meaningful to me, but not like, and there's an auntie I kind of know what pack and say. Do you know what I mean? Like that kind of like actual, as opposed to like, here is my pepeha, let me recite it. And like my whānau relationship was, that was tight my whole life. But that kind of sense of growing into an understanding of my iwi identity was important there. But then I was on the sabbatical, and I was meant to go home. You meant to go home after sabbaticals, and then this job came up at the University of Hawaii, and it was to teach Pacific literature. And I was like, that job's not going to come up very often. And and I thought, oh, I'll give it a go. And I was quite unhappy about the idea of going home. I wasn't that happy at that university, and I just thought, I'll just give it a go. And if I don't get it, it's all good. At least it's a chance for me to have like imagined myself into a different future or something. And then I got it, and I was like, damn it, okay. Off we go then. So that was in some ways, like going to do the PhD like ruined me, and that it showed me that there were ways that I could do what I do and be who I am outside Aotearoa. But actually it was moving to Hawaii was like me going, I'm not doing the go feel your kete, go home and live in Aotearoa for the rest of your life plan anymore.
Wow.
Sorry, there's a lot there.
I mean, something interesting you said before, when you just in passing said, being, how it's now cool to be a Māori scholar, and being overseas, living in the diaspora, does it make it even more cooler to be a Māori scholar?
It does actually, in really dangerous ways, to be honest. And I've talked about this a little bit, especially recently. It's kind of become more pressing for me because, there's not there's a couple of things. One is something that Māori and Aotearoa are not always aware of, is that like about 20% of our community lives outside Aotearoa, about 1 in 5. So it's actually like there's a lot of Māori outside New Zealand. And a number of Māori are in different positions in academic institutions, but also in other kinds of positions, like just doing heaps of stuff everywhere, and heaps of countries, and yes, Australia, and yes, the UK, but actually heaps of other places as well. But I have this kind of like flippant saying that, people always like other people's natives. And what I mean by that is when a Māori person's in Hawaii, people who aren't Hawaiian are like, oh, you Maori people, you're so great. You know what I mean? And you're like, we're not that different from Hawaiians. And I've heard how you talk about them. And then Hawaiians come to New Zealand and non-Maori people will be like, oh, you're Hawaiians, you're so amazing. And it's like, do you know what I mean? Like, and paired with that, something that Albert Wendt has said quite a bit is that it's easier to be Indigenous outside of your own place, because every single thing doesn't hurt in quite the same way. And I mean, really, I get to kind of pick and choose how I am going to be Indigenous here, because it's not like my whānau's not actually the ones up the road. Do you know what I mean? And so there are a whole lot of calls on my time that I'm happy to respond to, but a different kind of there's a kind of like you just get to pick more when you're away, and so what does that mean? It means that there's like a lot of privilege and there's a lot of risk there, because it's like if you let your ego get in the way, you're like, you're right, it's so great that I'm here because I'm Māori, and Māori people are amazing, and that's. But what you can do, this is something that a good mate of mine taught me when I went to Hawaii, actually, to live that time, to take that job. I've got a good mate called Kaimi, and she's the head of English at Kamehameha Schools, which is the big Hawaiian private school there. And she said, oh, can you come in and talk to my, some people that she was doing something with? And I was like, sure, I'm happy to come in, but I'm not sure I'm going to say anything that you haven't already said. Like, I don't really have any new material, because we kind of are in agreement about a lot of things. And she's like, yeah, that's true, Alice. She's like, I don't think you will say anything new. I was like, oh, okay, that's nice. But she goes, yeah, but they're going to hear it differently from you, because it's not a Hawaiian saying it. And she goes, your job when you're here is to say the things that, yeah, we're saying, but they're not going to hear it from us. And so I think that there's a kind of responsibility and an opportunity to kind of stand in solidarity and be heard in different ways, and there's in the academic world, there's a lot of like, oh, Māori people are 50 million times ahead of everybody else. And maybe I'm just like a bad Māori, but I spend a lot of time going, we're really not. We're really very far behind. Let me tell you the ways we fail to be Indigenous and a million times a day, and so and why we have like demographic things and cultural things and historical things that mean it's not really fair to set ourselves up in some kind of competition where Māori people are winning. So
when you go home, what is it like for you when you visit home? What I mean is having being now living overseas, and then just kind of going back to New Zealand society, because I can tell you how I feel when I go home. I live in Japan, but when I go home, and that in itself is a privilege, I just freak out. Like I freak out because like I feel like I'm being profiled if I walk into a store, like those things, and people don't get like here, you just I just go about my business. They know I'm here. I'm an instructor. I work at a private school. Therefore, I must have the qualifications. Therefore, no one bothers me.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that, every country there's racism, there's prejudice. So I'm definitely not saying Japan is like, it's such a peaceful country. No. They've got issues itself. But when I go home, I'm anxious. I'm like worried. Like I watch and observe, when I'm out and about, observe people and body language, and it just freaks me out because I always think, man, you go away, you come back, and I just still feel as a Samoan, you just still feel like you're always trying to, I don't know, you're always trying to find your place. Like I know there's some people are doing great things and, and so many different spaces and, really celebrating who we are, our language. We've got lots of books and there's all the literature out there, but living overseas and then going home, I just feel like we always we have to try like 10 times harder to kind of like fit in. And I'm not saying that there's no good things about New Zealand. Of course I miss home, and that stuff, but yeah. Well, that was a lot. So sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So because I'm quite fair to look at, some of the stuff, like I'm just likely to get followed around the shops, then lots of my relations and all that kind of thing. So that kind of like really explicit kind of interpersonal racism is sometimes my experience and sometimes not, depending on where I am and who I'm with, right? Probably, so my husband is indigenous Fijian, and probably as a family, we probably raise a few eyebrows at home still. Yeah. People are like, depending on where you are, right? In some places.
Bombastic side eye.
We always, because we lived after Hawaii, I taught at a uni in Sydney for a while, and we're always like, man, at least in Sydney, at least in Australia, they're straight up with their racism, eh?
Yeah.
So
in your face, yeah.
Yeah. And so, sorry, we just got a little somebody interrupting. Do you mind if she interrupts? She can't hear anything because I'm on the microphone on the.
Hi. In Japan, we say kawaii, which means cute. You're so cute. Okay. Hi, lovely to meet you.
She's saying it's lovely to meet you, Baba. Say kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ah, kia ora.
This is Titilia.
Oh, beautiful name.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I have a wiggly tooth.
No, does that mean the tooth fairy is coming soon?
Is the tooth fairy coming soon? Yeah, actually, we were talking about this the other day. I was like, sorry, child, because you were born in New Zealand, you were assigned to the New Zealand tooth fairy, and she doesn't travel this far.
It's too far. Sorry, it doesn't go to the side of the world.
We still lived in New Zealand, but hey, diaspora problems, right? Yeah, so about going home, I think the thing is that, it's so easy to be romantic about home when I'm here, and it's also, the people I keep in touch with are mostly people who also agree with about a lot of things, right? And so like I kind of, so I get this kind of unbalanced view maybe of like how things are at home. Like, oh, it's really cool, and there's so many spaces that are really, affirming and cool, and there's great connections happening. And then I get home and I'm like kind of grumpy with New Zealand for being like still being stupid in so many areas. And it comes out of aroha because I'm like, we have so many opportunities here, and there are so many amazing people, and why are we just totally hamstrung by this dumb stuff, And like,
I agree with you. I hear you.
And I find that's I find that it's a bit gutting. Yeah. Like you get home and you're like, yeah.
So you're a professor there at the University of British Columbia. So you're in the English language and literature. Wait, is this even up to date? I didn't know about these websites. I did so much research on you, and I was just like, I gotta cross-check this information. I could be making things up.
You can make me sound more exciting than I really am. That'll be cool. So they have split academic positions over here, not for everybody, but it's kind of one way of doing things. And so that's when I was coming here, my position is in the Department of English Language and Literatures. But actually I have a split position, so 75% English, and then 25% is at the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. And so what that means is basically what it boils down to is like 3/4 of me is in English and 1/4 in Indigenous studies. And so because we teach like roughly 4 courses a year, it's like 3 for one and then 1 for the other. And then kind of like what I'm meant to contribute to each program kind of theoretically breaks down that way as well. That was kind of important to me to keep a foot in Indigenous studies, partly because it's different classrooms, like different people are going to sign up for Indigenous studies than for English by a long shot. But and that's cool. Like I wanted to stay in that space. Also because I believe in Indigenous studies. I believe in it a little bit more in theory than I do in practice. I think that there's it drives me up the wall half the time, Indigenous studies. It's the discipline is in a complicated space at the moment where there's, there's just a lot. But I really wanted to be there, and I'm really happy to be there as well. But the English department that I'm in is also not like a lot of English departments. So it's enormous. There's like, I don't know, over 50 like permanent academics there. And they made a decision before I started. So I got here February last year. The department had made a decision that they would do like a cluster hire, so that they would advertise to get, I think they brought in either 5 or 6 new academics, all BIPOC academics, so Black, Indigenous, and people of colour, and all focused on the historical fields. Because sometimes in English departments, it's kind of like, oh, all you brown people, you must have very recent literatures. But don't worry, most of the department will still be white people looking at Shakespeare and everything. Whereas this was about going, okay, a Black Shakespearean. Do you know what I mean? An Indian 18th centuryist, talking about enslavement in the Caribbean, And so it's a department that's really committed to, it's on a journey. Everything's on a journey.
Diversity, inclusion,
and like diversity and inclusion, like across the curriculum. So we don't just end up being like everyone kind of like clustered in one little kind of end. Yeah. So it was and there's 3 of us Indigenous people in the English department. I mean, I don't know, but I think that'd probably be a bit of a record around the world. I don't think there'd be many English departments in the world with 3 Indigenous academics, right? And from different places, 1 Cree, 1 Cherokee, and 1 random Māori girl. So and I was hired to teach Indigenous literatures, but specifically with a focus on Pacific Lit. And this kind of connects to the kaupapa of the stuff that you're doing, because I find it really like exciting and moving, and also really frustrating that here at UBC in Canada, I mean, we're on the edge of the Pacific, but honestly, most people here don't know that. They're like part of the continent. They don't really look, to the Pacific much. But as an English department, there's always people there going like, oh man, we're just so excited that we have someone teaching Pacific literature. This is what we needed. We're really missing Pacific literature. And I'm like, God damn you, why don't you work in New Zealand universities? Because most New Zealand universities don't have a Pacific Lit specialist, right? Most Australian universities don't have a Pacific Lit specialist. Some universities around the region are, like they no longer teach Pacific Lit at USP and Fiji. So as a focus paper, So it's weird to be in a place where there's this so I teach, I just taught a course last term called Reading and Writing at the Edge of the Ocean. And so we're reading Indigenous writing from here, and then Indigenous writing from across the region.
In terms of that's what I want to know about, as a Maori living in the diaspora, and then being in those communities, like with there are other Indigenous communities. So do people there see the correlation, in terms of Indigenous communities, Indigenous people, not just there in their backyard, but across the Pacific? Or do you know what I mean? Do they I feel like I want to go back to the whole romanticize Indigenous people and cultures. Is there an understanding of the importance of these communities? And
so I'd say among Indigenous people here, especially in Vancouver and maybe kind of broadly BC, and then down this whole coast. A couple of mates have started calling this the East Coast, the other East Coast, because it's the East Coast of the Pacific. Because most people call this the West Coast, because it's the West Coast of this continent. And down sort of below us here is Washington State. That's about an hour's drive south, and then Oregon, California. All the way down there. There's enough Pacific presence from communities. who have been living here. Hawaiians have been in and out of here for a couple of 100 years, and there's like
Wow.
long-standing communities here. And also, just, we all get around, eh? I mean, hello, you're in Japan, I'm in Vancouver, what's going on? How people have been doing this. And so, it always cracks me up. So the first like indigenous thing I went to when I got here was still quite pandemic-y, and so everything was a bit locked down and stuff.
Yeah.
And then when things were opening up a little bit, and they invited me to this like a lunch thing for students at the Longhouse on campus, which is like the kind of university marae would be the equivalent in New Zealand, or the whale in New Zealand, something like that, eh? So like a kind of cultural space where students can go and hang out and feel comfortable. And I meet that elder who's like the main like maskoiam there, the tangata whenua here, elder on campus, Elder Larry. And I meet him, and I'm like, kia ora, I just arrived here. My name's Alice, and I'm Māori. I come from New Zealand. So nice to meet you. And he's like, oh, my grandson's name is Manawa. And I'm like, Māori, of course it is. Do you know what I mean? Of course your grandson's called Manawa. And then turns out later on, we go to this dinner at this thing here on campus, and I'm hanging out with his wife, and we're like chatting away, and she's like, where's your husband from? I'm like, oh, he's from Fiji. Oh yeah, we got some Fijian grandchildren. I'm like, of course you do. Do you know what I mean? Like, so indigenous people have been connecting with each other. We're like curious about each other. Vancouver, I mean, certain parts of the region, especially because of the like Commonwealth kind of, keeping it in the empire thing, like indigenous people from Australia and New Zealand have been coming up here, a lot. There's like I've been doing some work, looking at kind of this long history of kind of creative collaborations between indigenous people from here, Australia, New Zealand. Now the regional Pacific is a slightly different question, and that, drive 2 hours south, actually not that far, drive an hour south, and you hit a town called Bellingham, and there's like heaps of Chamorro, other Micronesians that, like, so,
wow.
so there's big kind of communities from the kind of American empire part of the region that has brought people to that whole coast. So those communities haven't necessarily made up here, although having said that, there's a, really great Chamorro master's student here at UBC. So you're asking about how people understand how indigenous people understand other those connections are there. I mean,
non-indigenous people,
non-indigenous people here.
Non-indigenous.
That's another story. And I'll tell you what's interesting here, and this is, I probably shouldn't be going on record yet with my little reckons about this, but one of the things that's interesting about being in Vancouver is a place that has been for several decades, well, I mean, for like many places for over 100 years, but particularly for several decades, has been a place for a lot of people to move to from various parts of Asia, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so the big kind of discourse here in the academic world is this term Trans-Pacific. And what Trans-Pacific, it turns out, means is not the Pacific, And so I was like, okay. And I'd sort of had a bit of a hunch about that before I came here, but it kind of didn't bother me because that's not part of those aren't my conversations. So I was like, oh yeah, people in Canada saying a thing. Some people in America saying a thing too, but it wasn't really my issue, because I was in New Zealand or Australia or wherever else, and I wasn't kind of having to deal with that. But it is interesting where people here in Vancouver will look out. When they do look out to the ocean, they manage to miss everything, and then they see Asia, and it's. And like I get it, but it's interesting. So I had in my class, I had about 30 students in my class. I'd say probably about 2/3, maybe a half to 2/3 of them were within the last, either their generation or one generation before them had migrated from Asia, and various parts, so not just kind of one kind of site over there, and And it was so interesting by the end of semester that they were all like, I can't believe I've never thought about what was between here and there. So it was like, it's just this like, it's flying over. So
There's a
it's this
bridge.
really weird thing, eh? And so like, and see, because I did my PhD and then taught over in New York State, and then I taught in, like, I'm used to kind of over there, they just only talk about the Atlantic, and you're like, hello, there's another ocean. Everything's fine. Over here, they're like, we totally understand there's another ocean. Absolutely. And there's nothing between here and Asia. You know what I mean? Like, it's empty. And so occasionally they'll kind of have this, some people are, oh, well, we do talk about Hawaii. I'm like, yes, but it's not really the whole region, is it? So it's so there's a lot of places the conversation can grow. You can say. For me, this is the first time I've been teaching in a place outside of a kind of direct Pacific Empire, right? Because I've only taught in Hawaii, the US, New Zealand, and Australia, and all of those countries have very explicit, connections to empire, eh? So like New Zealand with its 100 years pocket full of colonies, like ongoing colonialism in parts of the region and all that stuff. Australia, having its colonial role, connections with the region. Hawaii, obviously, And so when you're like, let's talk about the Pacific, you can kind of like introduce students to like, this is really important. We know this is the history of this place is bound up with the region. These are the people in our classroom or our neighbor, like it's kind of like, and then I moved to Canada. I'm like, gosh, how am I going to sell the Pacific to these people other than when you're flying to visit your relations and you look down, that's the Pacific, But what's been interesting has been, I'm like, no, I believe there must be connections. I know imperialism. God damn it, of course there's connections. Yes, there are the indigenous ones, but like, what are the other ones that can make me, what are the things that can enable me to say, with some urgency, it's important for us to know about the region here too, right? So I've been teaching the work by this really great Hawaiian historian, David Aiono Chang, who's done some work about Hawaiians in British Columbia for 200 years. He hasn't been doing it for 200 years. I mean, Hawaiians have been here for 200 years. Sorry,
I was
David,
like, whoa, Abraham's cousin? No.
That's right. He's getting on. Yeah. So must be due to retire after 200 years. And then there's him and that work. But actually, it turns out that there's there's mining connections. So because Canada is rich because of mines, right? British Columbia, the province I live in, is rich because of mines. And what mines is code for, right? It's like stealing indigenous land and then ruining it by pulling.
Yeah, I was like,
right?
Are we thinking the same?
That's how that goes, right? And so Canadian mining companies have a massive part to play in the mining in Papua New Guinea, West Papua, Bougainville, right? Those necks of the woods. So it's like, okay, so now my job is, I'm still new enough here. I can't connect all these dots yet, but that I see that as my job is to kind of understand more about those connections, because that means that sitting here, I am benefiting from violence against Pacific people. If a lot of the money here is connected to. And then the other one that I just found out about is there's a person doing some research looking at a Canadian sugar company that has historical links in Fiji. So that's obviously got kind of personal consequences or kind of effects for me, because this little girl that came and interrupted us before is Fijian, father's Fijian, like it's like, okay, so let's find out about those connections. Sorry, I know we haven't talked about books yet, but
I'm just
here.
I can't even tell you. I'm so intrigued. Like every time you mention something, my brain's like, oh. Let's get back to that. Wow.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in and say one more thing. So one of the things that's like thinking about where you are in Japan, and one of the things that is interesting though for me is that I've got two colleagues who have started here just before me in Indigenous Studies, and they were hired specifically because they have expertise in Indigenous Asia. So one of them is a 𝚕𝚠𝚠𝚎 scholar, and one of them is a Sherpa scholar, and they have connections then with obviously Ainu communities, and there's
Right.
like, Okinawa, and those sorts of those communities, but they themselves come from Asian Indigenous communities. And so one of the other, so we can go like it's easier for me to be like, oh, these stupid Canadians, they just like look over the ocean and all they can see is Asia. But on the other hand, we're sitting in the region and we're busy looking, always looking one way to these big white countries on this side. And what about looking the other way and understanding our potential Indigenous solidarities and connections in Indigenous Asia? And so that's been really interesting for me, getting to know, both of these women as, as friends and as scholars and thinkers who come from incredibly different, Indigenous contexts, and also very similar. So like my friend Pasang, who's Sherpa, like she does work on climate change. And it's like, sometimes we kind of laugh about it in that way you do when you're talking about, genocide. But, she's like, your people are experiencing climate change at the sea level, and my people are experiencing climate change. Like she's not just from Himalayas, she's at like the village of Everest. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Oh
so
man,
she's from as high as it's possible to be away from sea level, and then Pacific people, of course, being so she's like at these extremes. It's our people who, as Indigenous people, are bearing the brunt of climate change, right? And so it's like, wow, there's some solidarity that had never occurred to me, right? And she has no relationship with the ocean, and is kind of freaked out still about how close we are to the ocean. Well, she's a mountain person, like that's where she's from. So actually she's gone back there again now, so she's just there at the moment visiting, and we get these little text messages, I don't know, 4 kilometers in the sky. I can't even, it just blows my little brain cells. So I also think that there's like it's sometimes it's easy to see other people's kind of blindnesses, and it's actually there's a lot of, and I know that there are some interesting ongoing, connections, but it's interesting to think about potential for more.
Yeah, I mean, Ainu communities here. I'm really lucky to be. I'm part of a New Zealand community called 𝚠𝚒𝚕𝚎. We'll do performances and things like that, or we get together for wānanga. But through 𝚠𝚒𝚕𝚎, like I've been able to attend the annual like Ainu celebrations that they have here in Yokohama. But it's real hush hush. Like it's not a celebration or a festival that it's open to the public. Like it's very and part of that is because some people like I knew only like a few years ago were officially recognized. There was some kind of like law bill passed only a few years, 2 or 3 years ago, I think maybe 2019, just before the big pandemic thing closed everything down. But so a lot of them do keep that heritage, like it's not known to others, but because of like judgments and racism and things like that, prejudice. So it's always to be a part of this and to attend the Ainu celebrations. It's they celebrate their culture, they do their dancing and their singing, and we're there representing. I mean, we've got a lot of Māori people here who've been living here for a while, so it's so cool to see two cultures come together. And then you've got the random, I'm the Samoan, my friend's the Tongan. It's
all connected. And I think like for me, one of the things is like, because how I said before, I wanted to do my PhD in the States to get out of like the British Empire. Okay, but they still speak English in America.
English,
So it's like technically out of the British Empire, but it's kind of the same smell. Do you know what I mean? Whereas like when you get into these other but when you get to connect with people from these other Indigenous contexts, like I'm learning a whole lot. I'm like serious. I was joking with my friend I know, who's my another friend of mine, and I'm like, man, when you talk about where you come from, I mean, I'm supervising a master's student at the moment who's Kazakh from Kazakhstan, and she's looking at Indigenous cartoons, graphic novels, cartoons, comics from her her country, and I'm like, man, sometimes I have to go like Google where these people come from. You know, like so ignorant to other empires than the kind of British or like Western European ones. And I find for myself as an Indigenous person, it becomes an opportunity then, because it's like there's all these ways that we've been kind of programmed to even understand what indigeneity and empire is like. And then it's like, oh, okay, so if the people that have like come over and taken over are not these guys, but those guys, you know, what are the other? Yeah. So I think yeah, good times.
So, you know, you're an award-winning poet, man. It's so cool to say this because I feel like I've been following your journey for quite a while. And actually, when I was sitting here waiting for you to come online, I was just trying to figure out, how did I come across Alice? Like, I think, I didn't know. It's just, I honestly was like,
Random lady, yeah, Alice, I don't know.
these authors that I'm always trying to connect with, you know, Māori and PI authors, but you're an award-winning poet. Yay! Congratulations. Your first poetry collection, always italicized, How to Write While Colonized, recently won the Miriam Peter Biggs Award for Poetry as part of the 2023 Ockham, I don't know if I said that right, apologies if I didn't, New Zealand Book Awards. So, which was totally cool that your mum and nephew accepted the award on your behalf. Oh my goodness. How special is that, right? How special is that? Okay, I've got all these other things lined up, but let's backtrack. Congratulations, award-winning poet. Oh my gosh.
Aw, thank you. Yeah,
Wow.
that was unexpected. It was 1 a.m. over here. Fuller and I were like doped up on coffee, trying to stay awake. It was exciting. You know, I had like, okay, so I've got like about 8 or 9 like PhD students in New Zealand who are, you know, obviously all, you know, Māori or Pacific, you know, various makes and models of Indigenous Pacific people. And so that's like on one thread. And then I had like my mum and my dad and my sister like updating me with text messages, you know, like, oh, my mum and my nephew had like found their way into the thing and they connected with a friend and they're sitting down and da-da-da. You know, and so like I was like, this is it. This is so awesome. And I did not like that was so cool for me. Just for that. It was a really interesting Occam's shortlist. So there were a lot of Māori and also other just basically non-Pākehā people. So like of the poetry shortlist, there was like 4 of us. Like whoever won, it was going to be a brown lady. Like
shout out the women of color. Shout out the women of color who like just doing their thing.
Right, and so like that was just so cool. And then you know when I heard that was cool. And then it was especially cool because my nephew went up and spoke for me, and that was pretty meaningful for me. There's poems in the collection about him, and I was thinking the next day, oh, it's interesting that you know he's 18 now, and you know he stood up and you know. First, you know, mahi to the, you know, te Ngāti Whātua is, you know, mana whenua and all the rest of it. And, you know, and he was speaking you know, speaking like a good, you know, 18-year-old boy who's been trained how to speak properly in various contexts because that's, you know, been important for him to be a kōrero in different contexts. And, you know, and I thought, it's going to be interesting for some people where that's the first time they heard Machu, and then they're going to read these poems about Machu as a little boy, or like my hopes or my fears for Machu as a little boy and stuff. So I thought, it's like that was a real sweet thing for me. Yeah.
And you know, I also read that this was the first time that award had been won by a Māori poet since it was awarded to Hone Tūwhare in 2002.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself also is significant.
It is. It is because my day job is being a scholar of this work.
You're like, I've read it. I got things to say.
Yeah. No. Yeah. there were, the first decade of this millennium, there were heaps of Māori, especially Māori women that I know of, who had collections of poetry ready to go that just couldn't get them into publication. Publishers weren't buying what they're selling, or weren't selling what they were, whatever, or, and so there was like this very few new poets came to publication in the first decade of the century, so between 2000 and 2010. And I think that shifted the momentum for published Māori poetry. So people were writing, but publishers were not publishing Māori stuff. And so there's this, it's almost like there's this like intake of breath or something, that kind of happened for like 10 years. And now people are getting into publication now. In large part, I think, because more independent publishers started stepping up and publishing.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it because your own people, indigenous folks, people of color actually getting in there and going, hey, you know what?
Yeah.
We're writing now. We're gonna independently put our stuff out there.
Absolutely. And even though I ended up publishing through AUP, that came about partly because I was talking to them about publishing a scholarly book, actually, and then the kind of conversation went, and I was like, no, I'm not going to send you my book again. You have already rejected me 10 years ago because I told it was too political. But it's a different group of poems, whatever. But still, that did linger for me a little bit. So it was incredibly humbling when that thing came out about being the first Māori person to win since 2002, but also not surprising, and because I'm me, I can't help but think about there's actually really structural reasons that's the case. And it's not just that there weren't any good Māori poets between 2002 and 2023, because so many, oh my gosh,
Man, so always italicize, how to write while colonized. This is, as you said, this is part of the work that you do, reading so many different texts. So this was released in September of 2022. And then there was this, I read this article before, I think it was before the release of the book. And you say, this is not a book about someone's life. This poetry does not describe all that I am as a person. And yet, so much of me is in here. This is partly because colonialism insidiously inserts itself into every part of one's life, and partly because writing does this too. I am here on every page. I am here struggling against structures of power that are represented and metaphorized in conventions of writing. I am here in every decision about footnotes, about the language in which a thing is written. I am here knowing the world is shaped by the decisions we make and unmake about when to italicize. Ooh. I mean, I did read the rest of the article, but that opening to the article was like, I was like, okay, there's so much in there. Like,
it's funny hearing you read that too, because
I was a bit dramatic. I didn't even know if I pronounced everything correctly.
I loved it. It was quite humbling in a kind of way.
It's just there's so much in there.
Well, for me, I will say too, we were talking earlier about me being in Canada. So I actually wrote that piece that ended up being circulated when around the time the book came out. But I actually wrote it when I was, because it just kind of poured out a little bit, when I was going through the final copy edits on the poetry collection itself. And that happened in a tent in our lounge in Hamilton.
In a tent?
Yeah, because it was the Waikato lockdown, so the one in kind of the second part of 2021, or near the end of 2021. And I was home with my daughter. My husband had a job that, was like in an enclosed environment, so he was going to work every day, and me and Titi were home, and I just had to entertain her somehow, so we ended up pitching the tent in the lounge, making it our little camping adventure or something.
Nice.
Anyway, and I was writing that, and I was at a very low place in that I knew that I was leaving. It was a secret. It had to remain a secret at that point. I was leaving because of explicit structural racism and bullying, lateral violence styles. And so it's interesting hearing you read those words and thinking about the person who was writing them on my laptop with my, at the time, I think 3-year-old crawling over me, going like, I'm about to leave home again. But I'm going to leave this book here. I'll leave these words here, but I won't be here by the time it comes out. So so I'm just sharing that it's interesting for me to hear, to hear that again, over here in for me and my family, a better place. Yeah.
How long, you mentioned there are poems in there about your nephew. I mean, how long did it take for you to actually put it all together? Like, get all those poems written?
So, so I mentioned that I'd been rejected by AUP previously. I had this idea that you kind of like, if you were going to publish a book of poems, you'd like get all your poems and put them together and send them. Not all of them, but so I was trying to like here are the different areas of my life, and they were the different kind of sections of the poems. And then at some point, I realized actually I didn't need to have all the things in the one book. That the book could just be about this stuff. And it always felt a bit niche because a lot of the stuff it felt was about like, academic stuff, and not everyone's like, oh yes, I'd love to read your poem about footnotes, Alice. That'll rock my world. It sort of felt like there'll be like an audience of 3 people or whatever. But actually I found that a lot of people experience structural racism, and a lot of people understand, and the stuff about the, my complicated relationship with te reo Māori and stuff like. So it's that it sort of came together, and then as I kind of started to see how this could work as a different kind of collection than being the like Alice on the page, but being the like this is one kind of strand or focus or whatever. Then I started to pull together some poems that had been around for a while. Probably the oldest one is Mad Ave. I think that's in the collection, and then through to there's one in the collection that I think I actually wrote when I'd already submitted the collection, and then I was like, oh, I've got another poem I want to chuck in there. Is that okay? And that was the one about it's called Room. Yeah. So they're kind of like written in different times, and then when I saw, this is how they connect to each other, and there's a kind of they tell a story this way. Yeah. Then I kind of could see what I'd pulled together.
Feedback from family and friends on your book of poetry, like, yeah.
So, yeah. So my sister always says, "Don't tell anything to Alice; it'll end up in a poem."
Okay.
Yeah, I usually ask. Yeah, I did ask Machu in particular, but then also a couple of other people that were, mentioned, just to make sure that they felt comfortable that was going to be out there, and that was yeah, it's interesting. I'll tell you what I found interesting is people who know me in ways other than being an academic or being a poet. And so like they're kind of seeing another part of the Alice that they know in really different ways, because this isn't like 100% of me, and so that's been really interesting, has people going to go, oh, I didn't, like, oh, I enjoyed this, or I didn't, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, because the synopsis of for those who are watching or listening, check the bio. I will have the link in there. Purchase the book. Check the bio. So you can follow Alice's journey. Connect with her on social media.
Yeah.
You will not regret it. Trust me, you will not. But the synopsis for this book reads: always italicized foreign words. A friend of the author was advised. In her first book of poetry, Māori Scholar and poet Alice Punga Somerville does just that. In wit and anger, sadness and aroha, she reflects on how to write while colonized, how to write in English as a Māori writer, how to trace links between Aotearoa and wider Pacific, indigenous and colonial worlds, how to be the only Māori person in a workplace, and how and why to do the mahi anyway. That last part, because I like when I'm researching you, I'm always interested, especially authors that come on, I'm always interested to read the synopsis of the books, but how it's written across different websites. But that last part, like how and why to do the mahi anyway. Like as I listen to you right from when we got online, I'm just like, how and why to do the mahi anyway. Surely there were times when you were just like, okay, I'm over it, I've had enough, but you just keep going. I'm coming back.
So many.
I'm gonna do more research. Like, man, like how do you and here's the thing, folks, for those who are listening, this is her first book of poetry. This is Alice's first book of poetry, but she's published other books. So this is not like, this is her first book. Oh, no, there's been other books, but man, how do you keep going? How, the how and why to do the mahi anyway. Keep going.
I think the cost ends up being quite high when you decide to do this work in the academy. And that's, probably one of the poems that has circulated pretty widely. Has been, I think, the last poem in the book, which is called The Indigenous Woman Scholar's Prayer, I wrote it sitting in the back of a conference session that had been put together to, I guess so we could collectively mourn and to kind of memorialise and remember 𝚠𝚒𝚒𝚎𝚎 Tewa and Tracy Mbani Whenua, who both, died young of cancer, both Indigenous academics with connections to Fiji, and all the rest of it. And they both died within months of each other in 2017. And that's the reality, eh? Like the cost is high, the price is high. I'm living in Canada, away from Aotearoa, all that. But there are, man, the good days, eh? And like, there's this really beautiful interview that this thing that 𝚠𝚒𝚎𝚎 Tewa wrote in a special issue that was memorializing E Pele Hau'ofa, the Tongan, prophet, writer, thinker, visionary. And apparently they sat in an office, and it means a lot more to read now because Terry's also passed away. But one of the things that Hau'ofa said to Tewa was, the thing about it is our job is to make way for people who are better than us. And I think that's the thing, eh? It's the creating space and the next ones. And I have PhD students now and master students who do stuff like beyond what I will ever do in my life. They just bring things, and and that's pretty. That keeps you going, eh? But the other thing is that there's a lot of work. One of the things that I'm working on a book at the moment. Okay, in theory it was due to the publisher yesterday. Anyway, still. But that one's called Belonging Together. It's a scholarly book. It's called Belonging Together, and it's Indigenous Pacific engagements with periodicals like magazines and stuff up to 1975. And man, our people wrote so much through the 20th century. Like, writing has meant so much to our people, and we have been writers and readers in our own languages and other people's languages, to each other, between each other, to other people. Like there's just so much, and so much of it remains off the record or isn't taken seriously or whatever. And so it feels like there's still work to be done. It feels like there's still like, and that is, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how do we think about the writing of our kind of ancestors, across the region, I mean, all of this writing in so many different forms and so many different languages and so many different like unexpected and random and cool places. And how do we think about how do we engage that in ways other than just like, oh yeah, here's a thing that proves this person is not dumb, which is like, hey,
Yeah.
and we are still in a place where people are like, in
Mm.
2023, people are like, wow, an Indigenous person that wrote a poem. It's very good. Yeah, credit to your people. Do you know what I mean? I'm like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
not really, actually. I think you'll find there are
Yeah.
bookshelves upon bookshelves, And so for me, because
Mm.
that's been the focus of my work, it feels like that work isn't done yet. I think what
Mm.
I will say that the thing I've been thinking about recently is it's a difficult balance in the academy when you're an academic, when you're an Indigenous academic, to remember that you didn't come here to change the university. You came here to
Mm.
do certain mahi, and you sometimes need to change the university to enable that to happen, right? But what's easy to lose is the mahi itself that you're in it for, the actual kaupapa, right? And the
Mm.
actual kaupapa, like I'm not here to decolonize the university. If I do stuff that enables things to happen, great. And I have to do
Mm.
that to enable this work to happen. But that can't
Mm.
be the end goal. And I think that it's about, do you know what I mean? Like it's about not
Like,
letting,
yeah.
it's so, that's how colonialism works. It's so
Mm.
distracting. And
Mm.
you can spend, you can be so distracted by thinking, I have to change this environment. I'm here to like
Mm.
colonize university. I'm here to like, speak back to I'm like, no, I'm not. It's not
Mm.
what I'm here for. That's what I have to do. But I have
Mm.
to do that to do this other thing, which is much more important.
Mm.
Um, do you know what I mean? And I think that
Yeah,
for me, that's
I
always
hear
an
you.
easy balance to strike.
Yeah. I mean, I think like as a teacher and, I think I've talked about this before on here is that, I work at an international school and the international school circuit, they've been called out many times, these institutions, private mostly
Yeah,
institutions, because, of structural racism, that kind of stuff. And for me, like, if I let that stuff get to me, it's gonna affect how impactful I am in the classroom. Now, what I mean is, I read the policies and ask, and where I work, I read policies and, I got things to say about that. And, I get included on, sitting on these committees where we look at policy. But it's real taxing, like mentally, it's
yeah.
exhausting because sometimes I get too deep into it and then I start going, okay, we got to change this. Then I have to stop, pause, and breathe and come back and go, wait, okay, I'm a classroom teacher first. I look at that as I'm doing the work at the grassroots level. Policy level is here. These are where the decision makers are with the policies. These policies can take, I get it. We're on this journey of diversity, equity,
Yeah.
inclusion, justice, all of that. Everyone's talking about it at international schools. But it doesn't mean things are going to change overnight. These policies, there'll be just a lot of conversation, a lot of back and forth, and it may not even change like over the next year or so. Like it takes time. If I spend all my time focusing on that, I'm going to be terrible in the classroom. So for me, I always approach it as how can I uh, build relationships in the classroom, create a more equitable learning space for my students. What
Yeah.
does inclusion look like? Okay, so we're at the grassroots level. Let's not worry too much about the decision makers. They're going to do what they're going to do. And they're probably going to do things that I am going to be very angry about.
Yeah.
However, I need to stay focused on being intentional, being impactful, and creating those spaces that are safe and brave for our students and equitable, building that classroom climate. So I totally get what you're saying because
Mm,
it's so frustrating, when there's this institutionalized racism, but it's just policy. It takes so long. And if you focus on that, it drains you and then you just end up being angry all the time. You know,
Yeah.
all people will say your passion is really anger. But anyway, so that was a very long
No,
response. But
yeah,
from the
yeah, yeah,
future context,
yeah.
I totally hear what you're saying. Like it resonates with me. You know, it makes so much sense.
I think part of it is like knowing your bit, and like,
Mm,
okay, so, and something that I often say to my students is like, you know, your PhD or your master's, whatever, your project is, you know, you can't do all the jobs. It's selfish to try and do all the jobs. You go do
mm,
your job, and then part of your job is making the job list for the other people. And
mm,
if you don't know those people, that's because they don't exist yet, and then we'll figure out how to, you know, bring them into this, you know, into this work. So I think that that's
mm.
part of it too. Is that sometimes it can be tempting to think that, you know, to kind of be like, oh yes, I must martyrishly, single-handedly change the world. Oh, like that's never going to
Mm,
happen. So
mm. You know, you mentioned you're currently well, you should have submitted that manuscript yesterday. Just say I'm not putting it in your face or calling you. I'm just saying
that's
you've
fine.
mentioned that, and then you've also mentioned, you know, being turned down. Like, I mean,
Mm.
you've also been rejected. And when we think about literary spaces, because you have published before, I mean, you know, as a Maori woman, a scholar at that, how has it changed? What I mean is 2012, you oh god, I gotta check my notes. They'd be making
Oh,
up
you're
stuff,
good.
Rosa.
Is that one
The
specific?
20,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, the ones
Yep.
were Pacific Māori Connections to Oceania 2012, which, by the way, folks, for those who are listening, won best first book from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. I mean,
Oh.
she's not kidding around here. She's not messing about. Like, when I tell you she's award winning, there we go. But you know, when we think about that, you also published another book in 2020 and then 2022, but you have experienced rejection.
Yeah.
Literary spaces from then to now, has much changed, or is it still very DC? What I mean is like dominant culture, even though we've got a lot of independent, you know, publishers out there. And okay, that was very long, but do you know what I
No, no,
mean?
no, I
Like,
got you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think yes, it's changed. It has
mm,
changed, and I think there's a few things that have changed. One is that there are more publishers out there, and there's a bigger range. And for creative work, there's like a lot.
mm,
When I first moved back to Aotearoa after finishing my PhD, so I started my first academic job in 2005. Really, Hui Publishers was kind of the only game in town
right.
for, and you know, Hui has done an incredible amount of work, and I'm not going
Mm.
to ever suggest that is not the case. But they also made a decision to really not publish a lot of poetry.
Ah,
So there's a very small number of poets who have been published through Huia. I taught Carlo Mella's first collection that came through them when I was at Vic, Dreamfish Floating. But you know, they really that wasn't an area that they were going to publish in, and they had their reasons for that, and that's fine. But what it meant was that for a long time it was actually really hard to get poetry into publication.
mm,
And that's where I think a lot of these other presses have kind of stepped up and gotten this work out there. Some Māori poets have published outside Aotearoa, some have published in independent presses, and then now you see more of these kind of mainline dominant presses are sort of, I think, now starting to more accurately read the room in terms of like the market,
mm.
which on one level is what they've got to be thinking about because they're making a thing to sell. Yeah, so I think that has changed. Also, I think there's more out there, more people out there. I think that there's bigger range of, like in a lot of different ways, there's a bigger range of Indigenous people writing, and so
Mm,
like so there are kind of whole presses and anthologies and collections and collectives and, you know, kind of focused on, you know, particular kinds of Indigenous experience, whether that's sexuality or
mm,
gender or, you know, location or whatever. And so I think that also has changed. I think that some things haven't changed. I think that the New Zealand literature scene remains kind of weird and elite and cliquey.
mm,
Um, but I also think that actually heaps of us have gone, yeah, I'm not really into that, eh? So,
Right.
so now it's kind of like, it's like we're like, oh, that's all right. We don't need to go to your party anyway. It's quite a good one on the porch, you know. We're hanging out with good people anyway, you know. So I think that stuff has changed. I think one thing that I am looking forward to changing a little bit more is publishing in te reo. And alongside that, I think publishing in other indigenous Pacific languages. Like I feel like that's kind of the next thing, that there really aren't any publishers kind of cracking that market at the moment. Huia has done a little bit with short fiction in te reo, but there's very little published, that's kind of creative work in our languages. And I think that there's more and more people who have the language capacity, and so it's just a matter of kind of, you know, getting into that. But, you know, I don't know any poets that have a book of poetry that haven't been part of writing groups, and, you know, like sending little things off here and there, and, you know, little one-off random, you know, kind of like thingies that you kind of get together and, you know, do a little performance together or whatever. And I've had mates who have been really, you know, encouraging to me, and you know, I had a mate, Brandy, who's a brilliant, amazing, incredible Kanaka Maoli poet in Hawaii. And when I was doing my PhD and over there for the year, like we would meet and have like go out for dinner at about once a month. We'd like go out for dinner and like share a recent poem with each other and like read it and then give each other feedback. And she was really good, eh? She'd be like, yeah, nah, I don't like the ending. I'd be like, obviously you just don't understand, it's genius. You know what I mean? Like it's really, it's like someone saying you got an ugly baby, and then you're like, oh, actually I think you're right, the ending. And it's only a dear friend that can actually say that and you hear it. Do you know what I mean? So I think, so I also think that there's stuff that's changing, and the really important bit is still actually vibrant, which is the stuff beyond what can be seen.
Are there any authors or writers that you fangirl over? Like that you're just a total fan of, like, or are you just like, man, I'm too chill for that, man. I'm just too chill for that.
Oh my gosh, no, so many, eh? You know, I've always been very clear. My favorite poem in the world is Perhaps the World Ends Here by Joy Harjo. She's an American Indian poet. That's just like, that's a bit of a, I will never pass that poem by. And my favorite novel in the world is Patricia Grace's Baby No Eyes. But yeah, there's just so much out there. I've been loving reading. You know what I've been loving doing, this like research project and like finding our beautiful, beautiful published writing, including poetry, fiction, you name it, and all these like magazines, periodicals. You know, if you like go online and find like Te Aohau through the like National Library, it's like, it's all free. It's all just there, just hanging out, waiting for us to read what our people have been writing in like the 60s and 70s. The Mana magazines, you know, the not the Mana magazine from like the 90s, but like the journal Mana that came out of Fiji, that Marjorie Crocombe, you know, who sadly recently passed away, you know, she edited, you know, like there's there's so much of that historical stuff. And because my head is in there at the moment a lot, I've got a whanaunga, Debbie Broughton, who has a totally amazing book. And
yeah, why does that name sound familiar? Did she?
Oh my god, I'm forgetting the name of the book because it's late at night.
I feel like I talked about it. Let me just have a look. I feel like that name just sounds so familiar. I was like, I know I talked about this before. Yes. Yeah. When I had Coco Solid on here, she talked about this book, the Aniwaka.
The Aniwaka collection.
Aniwaka, room. Debbie Broughton. That's it.
Aniwaka Room. Amazing book. And it wasn't eligible for the Ockhams because they have, you know how these things work, that they have a rule that there's something about the publisher, the publication system thing, and for some reason the way that it was published by the publisher that it's with didn't meet that eligibility. It was something about its availability or something or other. but that actually came out last year as well, and
Yeah.
it's a beautiful and amazing and incredible book. Yeah. No, so many. Oh my gosh, I've gotten all like about it. I will say the collection of poetry I taught here was 𝚠𝚒𝚕𝚘𝚗𝚒𝚎 collection, 𝚕𝚒𝚘𝚗𝚒𝚕𝚘𝚗𝚒𝚘𝚗𝚒𝚘𝚗𝚒𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑𝚑 Kathy is someone that I knew and actually taught when I was at University of Hawaii, and she, like, it's been really cool teaching her poetry here. And it's always nice when you teach a book of poems, because you kind of get to like really connect with it in a different way than when you're reading it for fun. Fun. Yeah. Oh, there's so much good stuff. I feel like I should be like representing all these amazing, writers. Yeah. I'm just starting to connect now more now and reconnect with Indigenous Canadian writing, and that's kind of my summer plan is to go on a bit of a bender reading some more of that.
Man, that is, I just want to mention this just for those who love podcasts and might want to check this out and go and listen. So a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, a research project and educational podcast, Writing the New World. This is available on Apple Podcasts, everyone. With Wanda Yeremia Allen, the podcast shared research and ideas related to your research project, Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975, and supported by the Marsden Fund. And it was a journey with, alongside 16 Indigenous researchers. The podcast. So this is available, guys. Go check it out if you're interested. The podcast celebrates.
It's even on YouTube if you like pictures. Yeah.
Check it on YouTube. Like I'm telling you, like for those, for those scholars out there, or just for anyone, seriously, check it out. It's a podcast that celebrates what can happen when we connect across generations, archives, disciplines, institutions, communities, experiences, and perspectives. Yes, I did copy paste that directly from the podcast bio. Thank you very much. I did. No shame, no judgments, please. So, yeah, like, is that something that I know it was just a series of podcast segments, but is that something you might want to delve into, with other work that you do? Because, wow.
Yeah, for sure. That was one of those things, there's not many silver linings to the recent pandemic, and a lot of terrible, terrible things did occur, and a lot of people lost a lot of people. But I'd gotten this funding to do this research. And then one of the things that I'd said to the funders I was going to do was to run an international conference. And it's like, what you can't really do in a country with closed borders. So, and when no one wants to travel, understandably. And so I was like, well, how else could we do it? And so the podcast really did come out of like, and actually, I think it ended up being way cooler than if there'd been like an international conference of, nerds hanging out in a room for a few days. And so, and it gave me I kind of basically blew the conference money on being able to hire more Indigenous researchers. And then the podcast and the main, I've worked really closely with Wanda Yeremia Allen, who's an amazing Samoan PhD student about to finish her PhD. She just won a really prestigious Pacific Researcher Fellowship to go to the University of Cambridge and work in their archives over the next couple of months. Like she does incredible work. She's working on Les Tulu Samoa, the e whakasa Samoan language, and she's just doing like amazing, incredible things. And she's also like very organized and very onto it, and just has a lovely way with people. And so she is the main interviewer in the podcast, and she did a lot of the coordinating. But it was a good experience actually. And one of the things that it did is, because when we would, drop an episode, all the whānau of that person, and then the community, of that person, and we did like some special little drops, like we did like a Samoan language week episode where that conversation was in Samoan, and a Tongan language week episode with that conversation was in Tongan, and we did that for a few of the language weeks. And so we kind of dropped them at the right time, so they kind of got taken up into those like cycles as well. And it just took so much of the research into places that it just wouldn't go otherwise. And it would be ridiculous to like let that be the kind of one time only offer. But like so I'm really keen. And you know, the good thing about working at a big giant elite institution with lots of resources is that's something that's quite possible here. Yeah. So I'm keen to do more, and also stoked that there's kind of a record of, you know, these researchers and the work that they did, all different kind of parts of the project of engaging with Indigenous Pacific writing prior to 1975. Yeah.
What an enriching experience. So if you're watching, if you're listening, check it out. I will also check the bio. I'm also going to put the link there. I mean, I tell you, there's nothing Dr. Alice can't do. Just saying, just putting it out there. Man, self-care. How do you look after yourself with all the different hats that you wear and the things that are going on and all the texts that you're reading? But seriously, though, serious note, how do you disconnect? Because
self-care.
Like you are very
I
precious.
quit my job and I go to the next one.
Hey, stop running away. I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
precious person that you are. How do you take
Mm.
time to just be like, even if like family time? I mean, how do you just
Yeah.
connect and just, you know?
This is a work in progress for me. Serious book recommendation is Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hershey. This is a fairly recent book, and it was recommended to me by a mate who also struggles with the off switch, and so and I've now been recommending it to all my students and colleagues and stuff. And what I love about the book is that you know, I've never really responded to the like, just look after yourself, just go have a bubble bath. You know, it's about you. Say no,
Light a
like
candle.
that. It's like I am incredibly privileged, and I have not a sense of guilt, but a sense of I can't stop. There's all this work to do, you know, like, and if I don't do it, then who's, you know, these are the things that are traps, they're all just traps. But and because institutions like to tell you things like, you're the only one that can do this, to like suck you into doing more work, you start to believe it yourself and stuff, right? And also there comes a point where like, yeah, actually, if you're the only person doing certain stuff and you don't do it, then it won't get done. So what has been hard for me has been learning how to make those calls. I've not always made the right ones. But the thing I really like about this book, and she's all over the internet, is is it the Nat Bishop? Yeah, so she's got this thing called the Nap Ministry, and her whole thing is about like napping and sleeping and everything. And she's all like, she preaches self-care in ways that make sense for me.
Okay, I need to look her up.
Oh my God, you have to look her up immediately. She's incredible.
Because I can't stop.
So this is her thing, right? She says, stop handing your body over to capitalism. And I'm like, oh, that's so much more appealing to me than have a bubble bath. You know, I enjoy bubble baths as much as the next person, but I'm not going to stop for one, you know? And so, and a lot of her stuff is about, you know, she's a Black woman from the States, and it's explicitly connected to kind of Black woman theology. Although it's not aimed only at people who come from a Christian tradition, but that's the tradition that she comes from. But and a lot of it is about kind of going, man, we have to rest because a lot of our ancestors didn't get to. Some of that stuff comes specifically from the history of enslavement. So we can't just totally appropriate the whole thing. But I think we can also go, yeah, actually, we, you know, our ancestors haven't always, you know. But a lot of the focus is on thinking about the ways that grind culture, keep going, just do it all, and including the ways that we kind of go, oh, this person's amazing, they do everything, they never stop. And actually, that's really, really damaging, and it's damaging as a model. and it's damaging as an aspiration, and that grind culture, hustle culture, that's just capitalism, like kind of taking our bodies from us. And, to be honest with you, to be quite serious, I realized that I've been to very few retirement functions for Indigenous women academics. That's just the reality. Funerals, yes. Farewells because they're leaving the academy, yes. Retirement functions, no. Right? So what is that? You leave because you're so burnt out and disillusioned, or you die. Like, these are the options. And as options, they're not that appealing. And so, yeah, I'm not getting any younger, I have a 5-year-old I'd like to see through to adulthood. The stats don't look good for Indigenous women academics. Many people assume that's true. I sat in a room once, a kind of a random group of Indigenous women academics, and I was the only one that didn't have a cancer story. Right? So it's not just like, do you feel stressed this week? It's like, are you going to die early? It's really serious. And so, and this is in a really privileged position, right? So, there's heaps of ways that our body, we know that in Aotearoa, our communities have lower life expectancy. Like, the stuff is so real. And so for me, I found that the stuff around resistance has been really useful for just kind of giving it to me in language that I respond to. I think family is a big one. So when I went back to work after having Titilia, my daughter, I was still breastfeeding her for just about the first year after I went back. And my husband stayed home with her and would bring her up like for her lunch, like every lunchtime. And I had this conversation with a mate once, and I was like, I just realized that I stopped for lunch like every day, and the world did not end. I made the decision for the first time in my entire career to stop for lunch every day. It's like, for all those years, I experienced that as something that was impossible. What, to feed myself? Like, this is like a basic thing of survival, and I couldn't stop for lunch every day. I wasn't like stopping for like an hour and a half and like lying on the beach, but like just stopping to like eat your sandwich. Like, do you know what I mean? So I think one of the other things that I've found is that, sadly, but maybe hopefully, I find myself able to make better decisions for myself when they're not about me. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think this is part of the decolonization journey, right? When I look, yeah, and I think we all have these models of people in our lives who have worked incredibly, incredibly hard. And I think what we can do is go, oh, we should emulate that. But there is another option, which is to say that is so amazing that they did that, and maybe they don't wish for us to also be as stretched and tired as them, And yeah, so sometimes it's just about going and having fish and chips on the beach on a Friday.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
I know. They weren't that good, but the beach was nice.
That's right.
Relax. It wasn't New Zealand fish and chips or Fiji fish and chips. It was, sometimes it's that stuff. But I think the self-care bit is, calling it self-care never worked for me, because that's just not, and that itself is a problem, right? I do get that itself is a problem, that, but I've found that, like, for me, some of that stuff has been really useful. Connecting with a spiritual side is obviously really important. A cultural side, family, these things are all important. The whenua, going out into the environment. I was on the Zoom call with this, like, a group of Indigenous people, and we were all like on like a kind of advisors for a particular project at UBC, and so random Indigenous people from across the place. And the person said, "Oh, just before we, just to introduce each other, because we'll meet each other for the first time, I thought we could go around and talk about, just introduce ourselves and say one way that we like to like unwind." And then we went around, everyone was like, oh, I like to go walk in the forest. Oh, I like to go walk on the ground. And I was more like, shame. I was so going to say I watch Netflix, you know. And then
Pressure.
this is the eternal struggle. Like, am I doing it wrong as an Indigenous person that I am not like, I must go connect with the whenua now? Or am I doing it right that I'm finding my own way to unwind? I don't know. I think a bit of both. I think a bit of Netflix. I think a bit of whenua, you know. Yeah. What
so
not
funny.
to wear right here.
You know, if a book was written about you, what would it be called?
Ooh. Did she ever stop talking? No. Ooh. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good one.
Something for you to think about.
Yeah.
Just, you know, just and you know, you've mentioned a couple of Rex book recommendations. Is there anything else you want to plug? You know, anything else that you're like, this is an absolute must read? Anything else you want to drop?
Oh man, if only it wasn't like 5 to 11 on Friday night, I'd be like all onto it for you. You know what? I'm just gonna conceptually plug something. I just really encourage people to read the work from their own community, right? And like find the people in your community who are writing and just believe that those people are out there, and then your job is to go find them, you know. So that's one, is to like don't just read stuff from other people. But on the other hand, too, the Indigenous world is massive, and there's so much beautiful writing that is so hard to track down, but it is worth it. And so, you know, one of the things that I want to mahi to you for your podcast, because you're kind of pulling together, you know, people who might not be in conversation, and people are able to kind of hear, you know, from different perspectives, but also different empires, different islands, different sites, different, you know, networks. And I think that it's so easy for us to end up thinking that the people that we know, or the top 6 writers that we would mention, are like all of it. And I think that's really dangerous. And you know, if you're not familiar with what's happening in the Fiji poetry scene, or the Hawaii poetry scene, or the, you know, Guam poetry scene, do you really know what Pacific literature is? Yeah, so read widely would be my my one. Yeah. I know that's not a specific recommendation.
No,
it's
no,
not
that was
I have nothing on the yeah.
perfect. That was a great way to kind of like wrap up our kōrero. You know, I have kept you online for the longest time, but I just can't stop. And I just want to say, you know, as we wrap up the show, oh, Alice, it's just, oh, it's been such an honor to have you here. I absolutely love what you're doing out there. I love your advocacy. I love your heart for community. I love what you're doing in Indigenous spaces. And for those listening and watching, click on the bios, click on the links in the bio, get connected, check out the writing, check out Indigenous authors. Before we drop this, I'm going to somehow find a way to get a list of book recommendations that we can also post on IG from Alice. So I know she's just met so many amazing writers. She's got access to that. So we want to be part of that. We want to get access to that and understand there's more than what we're seeing.
Yeah.
You know, on mainstream spaces. So I just want to wish you and your family, you know, all the best. Be safe out there. Hopefully you take that 12-hour drive to that new fish and chip shop. Be safe. It's just, I'm just so blessed and humbled that you were able to share just a little bit of this amazing journey that you're on. So just keep on, and inspirational. That's all I have to say. So over to you to wrap up the show with some final gems, some final words of knowledge, some wisdom.
Well, I'll just finish by, you know, just to mahi to you for the work that you're doing. think the work that you're doing is the kind of work that creates space and creates connections and makes networks visible that aren't always visible. And I know you're doing this in your nights and weekends, and I hope you're going to read Rest is Resistance, very helpful book. Just saying no, but
I'm already there. On my phone as you were talking,
I'm already
I was
following her on Insta. We're good to go here, But I don't want to undermine the work that you're doing, though, by leaving it, with that flippant comment, because the work that you're doing is great, and it's important, and it's exciting, and our people have been reading books and writing books for so long across this ocean, and one of the worst lies about us is that we don't do that, and we have to constantly come up against that. And I love the work that you're doing, just to finish by mahi to you for the mahi that you're doing. And I don't know the circumstances about how you've ended up in Japan, but sometimes it's when you're away that you've had to pluck apart some of the things that keep you thinking one way, and you kind of get to see things in another way. And so, acknowledge that there's probably some things that you miss, and some senses of distance, but you've actually enabled all of this proximity. So, kia ora.